All right, guys. This is lecture 1 for Mr. Pruitt's American History course. I'd follow along with the questions and key terms that are provided on the website. Those are probably due tomorrow or in the very near future. And what we start with is Pre-Columbian North America. The reason we call it Pre-Columbian North America is because of this gentleman right here, Christopher Columbus. So once Columbus shows up, everything changes. So this is going to be basically what life was like before Columbus. All right, pre-Columbian Indian civilizations here. So 12,000 to 15,000 years ago, nobody's 100% sure, people from Asia, right, are going to travel across the Bering Strait. Now the Bering Strait is going to be in this map you can see right here. It's called Beringia, but the Bering Strait is going to be a little sliver of land between present-day Alaska and Siberia. With the Ice Age, the sea levels dropped, and it exposed some land, and people began to travel across it. Now, why did they travel across it? As it says right here, to find food. Okay, woolly mammoths, mastodons, whatever. People began to follow them across. As you can see, the black lines, right, leads them through this ice sheet or along the coast if you follow the red lines, and into North America. Now, this is up for debate. Okay, this is one of those things that's not considered gospel, if you will. It's some people think rudimentary boats carried people from the Pacific. But one thing that we do know for sure is early men who traveled through North America on their way to South America had campsites, and these campsites basically left trash pits, and they can track trash pits, all the way through Central North America down into South America, and they can date those thanks to carbon dating and stuff like that, and see chronologically that this is how people moved across the continent. Now your textbook's going to talk about the Canadian Shield. Okay, so the Canadian Shield is basically this idea right through here, which was the first part of North America to probably break through the sort of primordial sea, and eventually it's going to be covered with ice as it is here. Okay, this is dealing with the Ice Age and all that sort of stuff. Bigger deal with your world history class, I imagine, and probably already heard of it. Now, pre-Columbian Indians is considered here New World peoples, right? 54 million inhabitants of the New World spoke over 2,000 different languages. Now, this number varies depending on your source. Yet again, this is all stuff that we don't have a written history of. So we don't necessarily know this for sure. This is what the current textbook we use says. So this is why I put it in here. Reality versus myth. A lot of times we look at sort of pre-Columbian civilizations in the United States as living harmoniously with nature and each other, and that wasn't the case. These tribes fought each other. They manipulated the land, much like Europeans will. And so when we think of this sort of harmonious way these guys lived, it's not really true. They fought each other. They drove people off land. They, created their own sort of trash, all that sort of stuff. So it's not this continual harmonious relationship that we think of. Now, early man was going to be a hunter-gatherer, and eventually we see the advent of farming. Yet again, probably talked about it way more in your world history class. But what you need to understand is around 2000 BCE, the advent of corn farming. And this corn farming allowed for larger population centers, as we're going to talk about here in a second, with the Aztecs and the Inca and all that sort of stuff. Most of these early pre-Columbian civs did not have a nation state, right? A large population centered around urban areas. Okay. Now there were a few, and we'll look at them, but for the most part, it didn't happen. It took the advent of corn farming, and then in a little bit when we talk about the Three Sisters farming, that's really going to be what begins to help the population grow. One of the early civilizations, your textbook's not really going to talk too much about the Maya, but one of these early civilizations is going to be the Maya, as you can see in southern Mexico, Central America. They were an advanced civilization. They had calendars and pyramids. They predate the Aztec and the Inca, so they would have had nation states. They actually had little city states. They didn't form one large nation. They were kind of like ancient Greece in that example. For example, they exploited the rainforest with deforestation, as we talked about before. Early pre-Columbian civilizations did exploit the land. And eventually, due to overpopulation, taxing by their kings to continue these wars, and drought, the Maya sort of fell apart. Now, this doesn't mean that people still today don't recognize themselves as Maya. If you travel to Mexico, some people still see themselves as Mayan. But the large cultural centers that once existed are going to be kind of absorbed by the Aztec and the jungle. Speaking of the Aztec, 12,000 AD, we had the Toltecs, and eventually by 1300, we get the Aztecs. We'll look at this more in class. You can see the timeline right here. But as it says right here, the Aztecs were an empire. I'm not sure. Oh, I see. Just, it was a large, I'm not sure why the numbers here are so weird, but understand that it was a large empire. The capital of which was Tenochtitlan. And as I said before, them and the Incas considered kind of the height of this pre-Columbian civilizations, because they formed what we refer to as a nation state. According to the fine people at Merriam-Webster, a nation state is defined as a form of political organization in which a group of people who share the same history, traditions, and language live in a particular area under one government. So that's the big thing you need to understand. Yet again, a large population that had a rather homogeneous culture submitted itself to a government of its choosing or by force, or however you want to think about it. Now, there's kind of four pre-Columbian civilizations we're going to look at. We're not going to actually talk too much about the Adena Hopewell, but they would have been over here in the Ohio River Valley. You're going to have the Mississippian Indians, and you're going to have the Anasazi Indians in the Southwest. Also, we're going to look at the Iroquois, or the Seven Nations, up here in the Northeast. All right, the Mississippian Indians, as you can see, kind of in southeast central North America, were agricultural, which meant they farmed, right? They grew maize, they grew beans, all this other stuff. They had a death cult very similar to the Mayan and the Aztecs. They also, from what we found, they had these large burial mounds. There's a lot of actual archaeology in those areas where they found all sorts of interesting things. And if you do a quick search on the internet, you'll find there's a very deep history, I guess, surrounding some of these groups. The most important area of these is going to be Cahokia. That's the image down here. Cahokia is going to be, I'm trying to find it on the map, right here, and roughly outside of present-day St. Louis. This would have been the largest of these pre-Columbian civilizations that are going to basically rise and fall before the Aztec and the Inca. The Anasazi Indians, okay, you can see right here in the Four Corners region of Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Utah. They're famous for their cliff dwellings, as you can see right here. They live in this arid area, so they developed irrigation systems to help them survive. And also, because of they living in such harsh conditions, they didn't have really a class structure. There wasn't like a nobility or kings or anything like that. They lived in a somewhat socialistic society. Their name came from the enemy's ancestors, which kind of means they've been around for a long time and kind of stuck it out. These Pueblo-dwelling Native Americans are going to be important in the Southwest United States when we look at the interaction with the Spanish. Much like when we talk about the Iroquois here in a second and their interaction with the English and the Dutch and the French and all that sort of. All right, the last one we're going to look at here is Iroquois, right? Part of the Six Nations Iroquois Confederation. The Confederation is started by their famous leader Hiawatha, right? Part of the Mohawk or the Onondaga Indians, whichever version you read. What you need to understand is that this group of Iroquois. They all had unique languages, but they shared basically a common language that groups them as the Iroquois. And so they formed the Iroquois Confederacy as a way to basically to continue to exist. Now, the Iroquois, like many of the other Native American tribes, were famous for utilizing the Three Sisters form of farming, which was basically the Three Sisters are beans, maize, and squash. Okay, and why this is important, it allowed for basically surplus calories. The amount of effort to farm and the amount of calories out were good, and so then in turn, you could also save a lot of that food, and so yet again, you could feed more people over a longer period of time. Another interesting thing about the Iroquois is they were matrilineal, so things were passed down through the female side of the family, right? And so instead of it going from father to son, it went from mother to daughter. Now, yet again, an important thing here is that the Iroquois are going to be influential when it comes to looking at the French and Indian War and the early colonial things, namely from their geography and the fact that they were a fierce adversary for the colonials. So lastly here you have a large overlook of the entire sort of country. And you have the Eastern Woodland Indians up here with the Iroquois, the Algonquin, and the Muskegon. You have the Great Plains Indians with the Blackfeet, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, the Comanche, and the Sioux, right? So think out here. And out west, right, you got the Tillamook, the Chinook, the Pomo, and the Chumash. These would have been a distinctly different group than the rest of these guys, right? Yet again, geography is going to play a large role in how these people live and survive. Clearly, the Western Indians, which we don't talk about very much in your textbook, doesn't talk about, were big into fishing. We get the totem pole, that sort of stuff from the Western Indians. The rest of these Indian groups, though, right, will come into contact more as we see the story of the United States unfold. Really, what we want to take away with this beginning part of the chapter is that before the Europeans showed up, there were Native Americans fighting themselves, exploiting the land, all that sort of stuff that we already talked about. And they're not going to be ready to deal with the Europeans when they show up. Now, at the same time, the Europeans aren't going to be ready to deal with North America on a whole, but we're just sort of setting the stage for the introduction of the Europeans.